I'm Christopher, and this is Animal Attacks. Today, I'm looking at cases where Karens underestimated deadly animals. From a beach where a washed-up jellyfish-like creature is picked up out of curiosity and turns out to be deadly, to a forest trail where getting too close to a hidden cub suddenly triggers a defensive charge from the brush. But first, inside a zoo service corridor, a missed gate led straight into a restricted tiger area. It was August 14, 2015, in a local zoo in Knoxville, Tennessee. Summer humidity clung to the concrete walkways as visitors moved through the big cat section under a clear sky. A male Amur tiger paced inside his enclosure, occasionally passing near the viewing fence as guests paused to watch. 47-year-old Darlene Hust had driven to Bramblewood with her younger sister Wren after a tense argument earlier that morning. She worked the front desk at a dental office and was known among friends for being firm in her opinions once she settled on them. She often described animals in human terms, sometimes saying she believed they could sense emotional states. She had also developed a habit of interpreting animal behavior as personal expression rather than instinct. The Amur tiger, Cossack, was one of the zoo's adult males, weighing roughly 430 pounds. He was documented as healthy and behaviorally stable, with no prior history of aggression toward barriers or staff. After arriving at the exhibit, they followed the public path toward a side viewing area next to a staff-only corridor. The corridor was clearly marked off limits, but a maintenance gate leading into a keeper area had been left unlocked that morning during routine cleaning. Darlene entered the service corridor first, assuming it was part of a secondary viewing area. Wren followed a few steps behind. From there, Darlene pushed open the unlatched internal gate, stepping past a boundary that led into a narrow keeper transition space bordering the tiger enclosure. Unlike the main public viewing area, this zone was protected only by a single chain link barrier and was not intended for visitor access. It doesn't look dangerous at first. That's the part I think people underestimate. At the edge of the enclosure, Cossack was resting, but alert. The moment Darlene approached the fence and extended her hand toward it, the tiger reacted to the sudden movement at close range. He surged forward and struck the chain link barrier with his forelimbs, causing Darlene's arm and upper body to be forced against the fencing. The impact drove her shoulder into the metal mesh. She sustained a fractured clavicle and a shoulder dislocation from the sudden lateral force. A deep laceration opened along her forearm, where a claw passed through the chain link during the strike. Wren shouted for her to move back, but the confined space limited her ability to pull Darlene away quickly. As Darlene tried to withdraw her arm, Cossack struck again through the barrier, hooking his claws into the upper portion of her arm and pulling her closer to the fence. The resulting force caused additional trauma to the shoulder complex, including likely soft tissue and nerve injury, consistent with severe blunt force traction. Darlene lost her footing on the uneven ground of the service corridor, collapsing against the base of the fence. At that moment, the unsecured internal gate behind her remained open, and she fell backward through it into the enclosure's inner boundary area. Now, inside the enclosure space, separation from the tiger was no longer protected by the primary visitor barrier. Cossack closed the distance within seconds and bit into her right thigh. The bite force caused a severe, comminuted fracture of the femur, along with extensive soft tissue crushing. The animal tightened its grip and shook her, which caused more internal damage and rapid blood loss. She lost consciousness shortly after the attack escalated. In situations like that, it's no longer about fixing what already happened. It's just about trying to get things under control. Zoo staff immediately went into emergency lockdown as soon as the breach was noticed. A keeper radioed for full containment while others moved in to secure the area. A deterrent hose was deployed from an elevated position in an attempt to push the animal back, but it did not disengage or leave the area. Knoxville EMS was dispatched at once, but was held outside the perimeter until the enclosure was confirmed secure. Once responders were allowed entry, Darlene Hust was already deceased. The medical examiner attributed the death to catastrophic blood loss from severe traumatic injuries, including major vascular damage to the thigh and blunt force trauma to the upper body. An internal investigation later confirmed that the incident resulted from unauthorized entry into a restricted keeper transition zone and the failure to secure an internal service gate. The primary enclosure barriers were found to be structurally intact. Following the incident, the zoo implemented revised protocols requiring secondary locking systems on all internal staff gates and reinforced access controls between service corridors and animal-adjacent zones. Cossack was retained in captivity, as investigators concluded the attack was a direct consequence of human entry into a restricted area rather than a breach of enclosure integrity. What begins with a breach inside a restricted zoo service corridor shifts to an exposed coastal shoreline, where danger comes not from barriers, but from contact with seemingly inert marine life. It was June 29, 2016, at Folly Beach, South Carolina. The tide had receded, exposing wide stretches of wet sand marked with seaweed, shells, and scattered debris beneath a humid, gray morning sky. Along the rack line, several Portuguese man-of-war lay partially buried and easily mistaken for ordinary jellyfish by casual beachgoers. Tamsin Broyle, 52, had retired 2 years earlier from her job as a school cafeteria supervisor in Somerville after a knee injury ended nearly 2 decades of work. In retirement, she lived a quiet routine focused on gardening, television nature programs, and long conversations with neighbors. Friends described her as self-assured in her opinions, sometimes to the point of dismissing caution when she believed she already understood a situation. She managed mild hypertension with daily lisinopril, but was otherwise independent and active. She had come to the coast for a short weekend trip with her neighbor, Colette Bram, and Colette's husband. It was her first time at the ocean in several years, and she had initially hesitated before agreeing, preferring familiar environments, but eventually accepting the invitation. Portuguese man-of-war aren't actually jellyfish. They're siphonophores, made up of different parts working together like one organism. Even when they're washed up on the beach, their tentacles can still sting. They're covered in tiny stinging cells called nematocysts that can fire on contact, causing sudden, intense pain, angry skin reactions, and sometimes more serious symptoms, depending on how much contact there is and how sensitive the person is. A local man walking his dog passed along the shoreline and warned nearby beachgoers to avoid several washed-up specimens. Most people stepped back. Tamsin, however, moved closer, drawn by curiosity. Colette called out for her to be careful, pointing toward posted warning signs, but Tamsin dismissed the concern, assuming the risk was minimal since the organism was no longer in the water. She crouched beside one specimen that was partially buried in wet sand and reached out to examine it more closely. Believing she was simply observing it, she lifted the translucent float sack with her right hand. From the outside, it looks harmless. In reality, the danger is already on contact, not after. Almost immediately, hidden tentacles beneath the sand and attached to the float made full contact with her wrist and forearm. The movement against the skin triggered multiple simultaneous nematocyst discharges, producing instant, severe burning pain. She dropped the organism within seconds, but exposure had already occurred across a wide area of skin. Within moments, a sharply defined, linear rash appeared along her forearm, following the path of contact. The skin became rapidly inflamed, developing raised welts and patchy swelling. Small fluid-filled blisters began forming along the affected areas as the inflammatory response intensified. The pain escalated quickly, radiating up her arm and becoming difficult to tolerate. Tamsin quickly stood and tried to move away, appearing severely distressed. Within minutes, she became lightheaded, nauseated, and weak, with rapid breathing and sweating consistent with an acute stress response to intense pain. Colette returned briefly with water and found her sitting unsteadily on the sand, pale, confused, and struggling to speak in short phrases. Her breathing was labored, and she was unable to stand without support. Nearby beachgoers assisted while emergency services were called. Her condition continued to deteriorate over several minutes, with increasing drowsiness and reduced responsiveness. She then collapsed onto her side and began vomiting as systemic effects progressed. Even with help nearby, the body can still spiral faster than response times. Before EMS arrived, she lost consciousness as her breathing became irregular and progressed to respiratory failure, followed shortly by cardiac arrest consistent with severe systemic envenomation and physiological stress. Folly Beach EMS arrived promptly, initiated CPR and advanced life support on the shoreline, and continued resuscitation during transport to MUSC Health Colleton Medical Center. Despite prolonged efforts, Tamsin Broyle was pronounced dead later that morning. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest following severe systemic reaction to Portuguese man-of-war envenomation, with hypertension and acute stress response as contributing factors. The case was classified as a rare, severe, toxic reaction to marine cnidarian exposure, with evidence of severe systemic inflammatory and cardiovascular reaction following extensive envenomation. Following the incident, local authorities issued a public advisory regarding Portuguese man-of-war sightings along the coast that week and reinforced warning signage in affected beach areas. From a beachside envenomation event driven by direct physical contact, the situation shifts into open savanna terrain, where risk emerges through distance misjudgment rather than touch. It was March 3rd, 2017, and the sun had just risen over Thabakaya Wildlife Reserve in Limpopo Province of South Africa. Dry acacia scrub stretched across the landscape, the golden grass still heavy with morning stillness. A safari vehicle had paused on a raised overlook where guests were watching wildlife movement in the distance. Greta Folson, 61, had worked in Scottsdale real estate for more than 2 decades. Recently retired into part-time consulting, she had spent a year preparing for the safari, studying wildlife documentaries and reading travel material despite having no prior field experience. She often described her domestic cats as a kind of small-scale wild animal, a comparison others occasionally challenged. She was traveling with a small group of American tourists, guided by Sifo Ndlovu, a licensed reserve guide. The morning drive had begun before sunrise with clear instructions. Remain seated at all times, keep limbs inside the vehicle, and do not approach or exit under any circumstances. The surrounding terrain was open but visually deceptive, with low brush that allowed predators to move undetected at close range. The rules are simple, but the environment doesn't make them feel urgent. African lions are ambush predators that rely on concealment and short bursts of high-speed acceleration rather than sustained pursuit. Earlier in the morning, the group had observed a pride moving through a dry riverbed at a distance. Greta commented that they appeared calm and not interested in people, despite being reminded that distance and visibility can be misleading in open savanna terrain. Later, the vehicle stopped at a second viewing point along a low embankment bordered by a wooden safety fence. From this position, a subadult lion was visible farther out in the brush. Sifo scanned the surrounding area, as is standard procedure in open terrain stops. Greta stepped onto the vehicle's running board and then climbed over the low boundary fence onto the embankment edge despite being instructed to remain inside the vehicle. She stated she wanted a clearer photograph and believed the animal's distance made it safe. Within seconds, a lioness emerged from the grass approximately 11 meters to her left. She was already in a low stalking posture, partially concealed by vegetation. Sifo shouted for everyone to get down and remain inside the vehicle. The lioness accelerated immediately. Covering the short distance in a few seconds, she closed in a direct line toward Greta. The impact struck her at upper torso level, knocking her off the embankment and down a short slope. She landed on her back, momentarily separated from the animal. The lioness quickly recovered and attacked again, biting the back of Greta's neck and upper shoulder. The bite caused a high cervical spinal cord injury, resulting in immediate paralysis and rapid loss of consciousness, followed shortly by respiratory arrest. Inside the vehicle, things broke into chaos fast. People were shouting, some freezing up, and one passenger tried to open the door before Sifo and the tracker physically pulled them back and told them to stay put. Sifo took a controlled shot into the air using a reserve-issued rifle under emergency protocol. It wasn't aimed at the animal, just enough to break the situation and force space. The lioness backed off a short distance, but didn't leave. She stayed there, watching, like she was deciding whether to continue or not. Even when it pauses, it doesn't feel like it's gone. After that, there wasn't much anyone could safely do. Everyone was stuck in place, inside the vehicle, because stepping out or firing again risked making things worse in such close, open terrain. They had to wait for backup while keeping everyone contained. By the time reserve response teams finally arrived, there was nothing left to reverse. Greta had already died at the scene. The medical assessment later confirmed a high spinal injury that shut down breathing almost immediately, leaving no real chance for medical intervention, given how fast it happened and how far they were from proper emergency care. The official investigation concluded that the incident occurred after Greta exited the designated safety zone in violation of guide instructions. The safari operator's internal review found that standard protocols were followed by staff and that the encounter resulted from a sudden ambush by a wild predator in close-range terrain. The lioness was not euthanized, as authorities classified the behavior as natural predation response following human proximity intrusion rather than abnormal aggression. Following the incident, The reserve reinforced boundary markings at viewing stops and updated visitor briefing procedures to emphasize that even short-range exits from vehicles in open terrain can trigger immediate predatory response. Greta's family requested privacy, and the incident was recorded as a rare but recognized human-predator encounter resulting from a breakdown of safety boundaries in a wild, uncontrolled environment. The setting then moves from open savanna visibility to a densely layered rainforest trail where danger is not immediate, but introduced through microscopic toxins and delayed physiological effects. It was October 11th, 2014, on a remote trail in Peru's Manu Biosphere Reserve, where dense rainforest pressed against a narrow footpath under heavy humidity after recent rains. The ground was slick with decomposing leaves, and visibility was limited by thick understory and fallen vegetation. 51-year-old Denise Harrow from Eugene, Oregon, was on a small guided eco-tour during a solo trip through South America. She worked as a private pet groomer and had developed a strong interest in reptiles through documentaries and online communities. Friends described her as confident in her interpretations of animal behavior and skeptical of warnings she considered overly cautious, often insisting snakes were misunderstood and that calm behavior reduced risk. The group was led by Mateo Vargas, a local naturalist with over a decade of experience in the Manu region. Before entering the trail, he gave standard safety instructions, emphasizing staying on the path, keeping distance from wildlife, and never interacting with snakes or other potentially dangerous animals. It all sounded like standard safety talk, the kind you hear at the start of trips like this. The fer-de-lance pit viper, Bothrops atrox, is a very venomous snake found in the Amazon. It hides well and often stays completely still, making it hard to notice. If something gets too close, it can strike very fast from a coiled position. Its venom damages blood, destroys tissue, and can lead to severe internal bleeding and organ failure. It usually doesn't warn before attacking and may stay still until it feels threatened. Midway through the hike, Mateo stopped the group after spotting a fer-de-lance coiled just off the trail, almost hidden in the wet leaf litter. He warned everyone to stay on the path, keep their distance, and move on without stopping. Most of the group complied, but Denise lingered, watching the snake. She said it looked calm and argued that snakes only bite when provoked. Mateo repeated more firmly that it was highly venomous and that its stillness was not a sign of safety. Denise crouched near the edge of the trail while the rest of the group moved ahead. Witnesses later said she appeared focused on observing the animal and spoke as though reassuring it rather than herself. She again stated that the snake seemed relaxed because it was not moving. Mateo stepped closer and told her firmly to move back. Denise still reached one hand, slightly off the trail, palm down, trying to show what she thought was calm, non-threatening behavior. The fer-de-lance stayed still for a few seconds, coiled up with its head facing her. Then it struck. It bit the side of her right hand between the thumb and index finger in a split second. Denise jerked back onto the trail, more in shock at first than pain. Within moments, blood started coming from the puncture wounds. Mateo pulled her fully onto the path and applied pressure immobilization, while another guide radioed for emergency evacuation support. Denise remained conscious at first, but quickly began reporting intense burning pain and rapidly increasing swelling in her hand and forearm. Within minutes, the swelling extended past the wrist, and her fingers became stiff and discolored. As the group moved toward the nearest extraction point, her condition worsened. She developed dizziness, nausea, and weakness consistent with systemic envenomation. Small areas of spontaneous bleeding appeared at the gums, indicating early disruption of normal clotting function caused by the venom. By the time they reached a clearing for evacuation coordination, she required assistance to walk. Her blood pressure had dropped significantly, and she showed signs of shock, including pale skin, confusion, and increasing difficulty remaining alert. She repeatedly insisted that the snake had not meant to hurt her. She sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Field responders arrived by boat several hours later and began stabilizing her for transport, but her condition continued to worsen. She lost consciousness during evacuation and went into cardiovascular collapse before reaching anti-venom care. The medical report listed death as systemic envenomation by Bothrops atrox, causing hemorrhagic shock and organ failure from severe tissue damage and blood clotting failure. Delayed access to treatment due to the remote location was a key factor. Investigators determined that the guide had followed appropriate safety procedures, including repeated verbal warnings and immediate emergency response after the incident. Following the event, the tour operator reinforced strict wildlife distance policies and updated briefing protocols, emphasizing that no wild snake should be approached or handled under any circumstances. The incident was reported locally in Peru and briefly mentioned in online herpetology discussions. Denise's family requested privacy, and no public statements were issued afterward. From a slow-developing exposure in dense rainforest to a fast, close-range predator encounter in Yellowstone, the difference is how quickly things can turn once distance disappears. It was July 18, 2013, in Yellowstone National Park's Lamar Valley. Early morning light stretched across open grassland and river bends, while dense willow thickets along the water's edge limited visibility just off the main hiking trail. Phyllis Dorn, 55, from Rapid City, South Dakota, was an experienced visitor to the park. She returned almost every summer and was familiar with staying on marked trails and maintaining distance from wildlife. However, she also believed she could often interpret animal behavior correctly and tended to underestimate risk if animals appeared calm. She was hiking with her friend Ruth Pell, 60, who was visiting Yellowstone for the first time. The trail through Lamar Valley was wide and relatively flat, bordered in sections by thick willow growth that could easily conceal large animals until they were very close. American black bears are common in Yellowstone, and females with cubs are among the most defensive wildlife in the park. Encounters can escalate rapidly if a bear perceives a threat to its young, especially at close range, where escape routes are limited and reaction time is short. Phyllis and Ruth spotted a young black bear cub near the edge of the brush, just a few steps off the trail. Ruth immediately told her to back up, and other hikers coming the opposite way started calling out the same thing, warning that the mother was probably nearby. When even strangers around you start warning the same thing, that's usually your cue to move. People began urging everyone to slowly move away together, keeping their distance from the brush. Phyllis remained where she was, keeping her attention on the cub. She believed it was safe at their distance and continued observing it, while others began to increase space between themselves and the brush line. Ruth hesitated, but shifted several steps back onto the trail. Unknown to them, the mother bear was moving through the willow thicket behind and slightly to the side of the group. The vegetation and uneven terrain obscured her until she was already within close range. At that point, she detected the presence of humans near her cub and began a defensive response. She first emerged partially from the brush in a bluffing posture, then immediately committed to a charge. The distance was short, and she closed it in a few seconds in a direct sprint. The impact struck Phyllis from the side, knocking her off the trail and into the grass. She fell hard, disoriented from the force of the collision. The bear followed immediately, targeting her upper body. The first bite locked onto her upper arm and shoulder area, causing severe soft tissue damage and a fracture of the humerus. In the process, a major blood vessel in the arm was likely damaged, leading to significant bleeding. Phyllis cried out as the bear shook its head briefly before releasing and repositioning. The bear then shifted and went for the back of her head. The force of the bite was devastating, causing a severe skull fracture and serious brain injury. She lost consciousness almost immediately from the impact. Nearby hikers shouted and tried to deter the bear from a distance, but none approached the immediate area. The bear remained for a short time over the victim, alert and defensive, before dragging her a short distance into the grass. It then disengaged and moved back toward the direction of the cub, disappearing into the willow cover. Ruth and other hikers reached Phyllis shortly after the bear withdrew. She was found unconscious with severe head trauma and a serious arm injury with heavy bleeding. She did not regain consciousness. At that point, it was already beyond what bystanders could change. Park rangers arrived quickly and secured the scene. Medical personnel confirmed death at the site following field assessment. The official report listed the cause of death as severe traumatic brain injury from a bear-inflicted skull fracture, with significant blood loss from the arm injury as a contributing factor. Wildlife officials later located and euthanized the mother bear under established park protocol for a fatal defensive encounter involving humans. The cub was captured and transferred to rehabilitation care. The incident was later classified as a defensive attack, triggered by close human proximity to a cub in dense vegetation with limited visibility. Ruth Pell received treatment for shock and returned to lodging later that day. She did not continue hiking for the remainder of the trip. Finally, the focus shifts from terrestrial predator dynamics to a riverine ambush system where visibility disappears at the waterline and the outcome is determined beneath the surface. It was February 27, 2018, at the Daintree River in Queensland, Australia. In the pre-dawn light, dense rainforest canopy filtered what little visibility there was, leaving the riverbank in muted gray tones. The water moved slowly through mangroves and mudflats, where the boundary between land and river was uneven and partially obscured by roots and sediment. Norva Stelp, 49, worked in logistics administration in Brisbane. Recently divorced, she was traveling alone along the Queensland coast, documenting her trip through photography and a private blog shared with a small group. She had limited experience with wildlife environments, but was confident in her own judgment and often relied on personal interpretation when observing animals. She arrived early at a public river access point along the Daintree system before any guided tours were present. The area was marked with warning signage advising caution due to crocodile activity, especially near the waterline and mud banks where visibility was limited. The saltwater crocodile is an apex ambush predator capable of remaining almost completely still for extended periods before striking with extreme speed over short distances. In the early morning, individuals may rest near the surface or along mud banks, sometimes with minimal visible movement, which can make them appear inactive despite being fully alert. At the river's edge, Norva observed a large male crocodile lying partially on a mud bank with its body aligned toward the water. Its mouth was slightly open in a thermoregulatory posture. She stopped to take photographs and moved closer to the waterline for a lower angle shot, despite a nearby visitor, Jerome Katz, calling out warnings and advising her to move back. Jerome kept telling her to step back, saying the crocodile could hit from close range without any warning at all. But she stayed where she was, still aiming her camera, trying to get the shot from just a few meters off the water. The animal didn't move at all, just lying there, so calm that it almost felt harmless, even though something about it didn't quite sit right in the background. Without warning, the crocodile initiated a rapid ambush. It surged forward from the mud bank in a short, explosive burst, closing the distance in seconds. The attack was direct and immediate, with no prolonged display or hesitation. The first bite struck Norva's left thigh with extreme force, causing catastrophic soft tissue destruction and likely severe vascular injury. The impact caused immediate collapse, and she was pulled off balance into the mud and shallow water. The crocodile maintained its grip and dragged her fully into the river in a continuous motion. After that point, everything just shifts into the water with her. Nothing stays on land anymore. Once in the water, the animal submerged with her, disappearing beneath the surface. As is typical for saltwater crocodile behavior, the crocodile likely repositioned its prey underwater in deeper sections or near submerged structures where visibility was limited and currents were stronger. The primary injury left Norva incapacitated almost immediately due to a combination of severe trauma and blood loss. Once submerged, she was unable to surface effectively, and drowning followed as the secondary and final mechanism of death. Jerome Katz immediately called emergency services and provided a detailed report within minutes. Search and rescue teams were dispatched quickly, but response time was extended due to difficult terrain, limited river access points, and low visibility conditions on the water. River-based units arrived roughly 35 minutes later and began coordinated searches of the area. Operations were complicated by strong current flow, submerged roots, and shifting debris along the riverbed, all of which reduced underwater visibility and hindered tracking. Norva Stelp's body was recovered several days later downstream, located within a submerged root structure, consistent with entanglement and transport through the river system over time. The forensic report concluded that death resulted from a combination of traumatic injury, hemorrhagic blood loss, and drowning following incapacitation caused by the crocodile attack. Wildlife officers later captured and removed a large male saltwater crocodile from the river system as a precaution after the confirmed fatal encounter. Authorities also updated warning signs and visitor guidance, stressing the need to stay well back from the waterline, especially in low visibility conditions. Jerome Katz gave a formal statement and did not speak publicly afterward. The incident stayed limited to regional coverage with no wider national attention. Norva's travel blog remained online, but inactive, later resurfacing occasionally in discussions about river safety in Northern Australia